8.
8. Chris, the topic we will be discussing today is, do you require your players to read the rules?
Mm. Hello and welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about topics related to running role-playing games. I'm Chris Salzman.
And I'm Andy Rao.
Andy, it has been a little bit since we've talked. We had the con sort of in between. We had recorded an episode like just before the con as well. So I mean, I think it's been like a month since we actually sat down to record a new episode of Roll for Topic.
It has indeed, but it's like, getting back on a bike or putting on a well-fitted glove or something. Just
Yeah.
it feels right.
Yes, it definitely feels right. So I'm glad that we're talking again. So it's been a little bit, so I wanted to check in on like sort of our media consumption. I guess we should probably have like a cooler name for this segment, but
Yes. If we
yeah,
were cool, we would have like a music
I
sting
know.
and
Yeah. So I'm wondering, like, yeah, what have you been reading and watching lately that's got your GM brain going?
Yeah. Oh, great question. I've been reading quite a lot of stuff, not watching very much
Hmm.
stuff. Maybe the most game adjacent thing I've been reading is I've been rereading from the beginning the Black Company series.
Yeah. Okay.
I've read this a couple of times at like different points in my life. Like it's funny to reread something and just be in a really different place,
Yes.
like personally when you read it. So I first read the Black Company novels maybe 10 between 10 and 15 years ago. Loved them. And I reread the first one a couple years ago and had trouble with it.
Hmm.
So it was a book I unabashedly loved on my first read through. I didn't enjoy it as much on my second. And then I like medium mostly liked it on my third read. So I don't know. It's
Interesting.
just been
Okay.
kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think, and we had talked. I tried to read that first one and bounced off of it almost immediately. And I know it's a really well regarded series. People seem to love it too. But we've since had a discussion on the Discord. It sounds like I was not the only one to sort of have that vibe from the
Yeah.
first book. So you would recommend? It sounds like you'd recommend pushing through, and yeah,
Yeah.
you could
Well,
do this at least the second one.
I mean, overall, I have to say I really love the series as a whole. I would
Hmm.
point to it as one of my favorite fantasy series. I would not be surprised if a lot of people bounce off the first one, and I would also not be surprised if a lot of people bail a little ways into the series just as it goes on, because out of necessity it really evolves away from the kind of the premise of the first book.
Okay.
There's a lot about it I like, and we don't need to spend the whole time here talking just about the Black Company. But a lot of the things I like about it are the things that feel pretty game adjacent. Like I felt when I first read this, it really made sense to me that this it appears in Gygax's Appendix N
Yeah, I
as
was gonna
one of the
say,
books that
yeah. Okay.
influenced D&D. Initially, that's a funny thing to say because the main characters are not like quote adventurers in like the Tolkien sense where they're on a quest doing something. They're much more soldiers with a job. To me, the part of it that feels most gamey is just the incredible, very practical minded, non mystical approach that these people take to the kind of magical fantasy kingdom in which they live.
Hmm.
Like they have grown up with this stuff, and so it's not magical and special to them in a way.
Yeah.
And the really amazing, breathtaking magic is so far removed from their everyday experience that it kind of convincing. It feels to me like reading about some project that Jeff Bezos is doing, right? Like I
Okay.
mean, or Elon Musk, or building a rocket or doing some
Yeah.
crazy thing. Is it might it be an amazing product? It might.
Hmm.
Might it eventually affect us in some way down the road? It might. But as far as like you getting through your day,
Yeah, it doesn't
doesn't
matter.
it doesn't really mean much, and it doesn't really touch on you.
Hmm.
And there's I don't know, I find there's that dovetails well with the kind of practical attitude players come around to in D&D, because eventually the mystique of a new magic item wears off, and it just, for all intents and purposes, it's just a +2 bonus to your attack roll, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And you can't maintain that wonderful aura for very long in a game setting. and it becomes like just a tool in your arsenal. Or you start going, which spell is the right key to unlock this problem, not, oh wizard, what mystical lore
Yeah.
can you draw on to illuminate this problem?
Yes, yeah.
And it's more things like, oh wait, if you use resist magic here, you'll get a +2 bonus. And
Mhm.
sometimes that kind of metagamey talk is distracting, and we've talked about that in the show in different ways. But it is a very human thing to do, I think, to
Oh, totally.
demystify something and look for the ways that it's useful to you. And that's kind of it describes how the characters in the Black Company novels approach all of this fantasy garbage as they encounter it. So I've
Yes.
just been talking for a long while. What,
Yeah.
any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, that sounds really good. I mean, I think that is the thing that attracted me to even try the Black Company was that sort of like groundedness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you had mentioned it, way back when I first tried it. So yeah, I should give that another shot. Especially like, yeah, like you mentioned, it's on in the appendix, and lots of people that I know and respect really like those books too. So I mean,
Yeah.
it might be
I have
time
a
to
hard
try.
time seeing you really enjoying the whole series, but I will
Hmm.
say this, if you're going to try it again, maybe skip the first one and
Mm,
read the second one.
okay.
It's I I had not been exposed to, Blades in the Dark when I first read it, but reading it now, it's giving off huge criminal scoundrel heist
Hmm.
vibes.
Yeah.
And I think you might enjoy it in that sense,
Oh
specifically the
well.
second book. So,
Okay. I mean, well, you know the exact words to get me to pick something
yeah.
up right there. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
How
Um,
about you? What have you been reading, watching, etc.?
so I have started up another read through of Lord of the Rings.
Oh, hey,
Yeah, yeah.
fantastic.
So this sort of like caught me by surprise. I just finished up the last book in the Dungeon Crawler Carl series that was published recently, right? So I'm sort of just
Yeah.
waiting on the next one to drop. Yeah, so I really enjoyed that series. It's lots of fun. I'll keep reading them as long as he keeps writing them. But yeah, so I finished that. I was like kind of looking for the next book to read, and then I was just like, oh, I mean, it kind of feels like it's time to reread Lord of the Rings. So I downloaded it on my e-reader and just started reading it. I read with my daughter every night just before she goes to sleep, for a little bit. So I've just been like, yeah, 15-20 minutes here there, kind of
Hmm.
making my way through it. And it's just, I mean, it's just a marvelous book. I think the
Yeah.
thing that's striking me this time going through it is and talking about like how books hit you sort of differently differently in
Yeah.
different time periods of your life. Like it feels like there isn't as much detail as I remember.
Hmm.
Like like thinking back on it, I just remember reading the book being this like very laborious, like detailed explanation of everything that's
Yeah.
happening to them and the journey that they're taking. And this time around, I'm just like, oh, I actually want more, right? Like I want more
Interesting.
description of what's happening. Like, yeah, it feels like it's Gandalf in the Shire, right? Like that's just a few. It almost feels like it's just a few pages. Whereas, previously first time I read it, I was like, oh my goodness, like when are they going to get out of the Shire, right? It's like, yeah, but now I want them to spend a little bit more time. Yeah, so I just got through. They just made it to Bree, and like right before that section is the section that's cut out of the movies. If you've never read the book, there's this character Tom Bombadil in the books who's just a wonderful magical being, and like everything about that section, like, I understand why it's not in the movies, but like thinking about it from in a gaming perspective, like the hobbits just sort of bumble from like one problem to the next, and they keep on getting bailed out by other by other people. Like Tom
Hmm.
Bombadil bails them out like a couple of times. And it's like thinking about like how you do it at the game table, right? Like I mean, I think at the gaming table, the hobbits would have been in a couple of fights. You maybe get to call on Tom Bombadil once, right? There's like all
Hmm.
these mechanics stuff that like just don't map well to the story, despite it being held up as sort of like this pinnacle of like this is how you tell an adventure.
Yeah.
How an adventure, and it's really, I think, influenced a lot of people's campaigns and stuff like that. But on the surface of it, at least the first part of Fellowship is not a very gameable sort of sort of story
Yeah.
in a
Interesting.
way. Yeah. I mean, like, not to say that there aren't lovely, parts about it, right? Like, but I find myself reading it this time just with like a very different mentality of like I don't think I'd want to turn this into a game, right? Whereas if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have been like, yes, like that would be the ultimate, is to
Hmm.
tell Lord of the Rings at the table in some way. Yeah, so I don't know. That's what I'm doing, and I'll probably check back in here or there on the podcast about my
Yeah,
progress.
please
But
do.
yeah.
Yeah, I have been feeling that little mental
Hmm.
tug that, yeah, it's probably about time to reread The Lord of the Rings. I don't think
Hmm.
I'm quite there yet, but sometime soon. So I
Yeah.
want to hear how you're doing. I was going to say, I feel from just anecdotally talking to people, maybe one of the first big shifts a typical person takes towards The Lord of the Rings is when you make it over that hump of like, the Hobbit stuff is boring and I can't wait to get out of it, to the like
Uh-huh.
exciting Balrog fights and stuff.
Yeah.
And then at some point though, you do shift and you're like, man, it's a bummer we're leaving the Shire because this is so delightful, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and just finding myself like reading and rereading the songs, right? And
Oh,
and it
interesting. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, because I mean, again, like the first time I tried reading it, like way back when, and we might have even talked about this in the podcast, a long time ago. But the first time I read it, it's just like you're just like skipping them left and right. You're like, this is boring. Why would you care? And it's like now to me, it's like those are the moments in the story where it's like this is sort of the reality that the characters want to inhabit. Like this is what they want to get back to,
Hmm.
right? Is this like sitting around eating, telling stories, singing songs, right? Like that's the life that they're fighting for again, right? And so it's just like, yeah, I'm really taking a lot of joy in those moments. Yeah, so
Well, that's awesome.
yeah, but yeah, so that I think that kind of does it for what I'm reading. But yeah, I wanted to, before we jump into our topic, just sort of mention offhand that Halloween is fast approaching. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know if your kids have aged out of Halloween or not, but mine are just like talking about it all the time.
That's
Right? Like,
fantastic. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Mine, my oldest is a, older teenager,
Hmm.
and I guess we'll find out if Halloween is still cool or not
Yeah,
in about a month. I bet it still is. So
I think so. Yeah, dressing up is always going to be fun.
yeah,
Yeah,
dressing up, free candy. Yeah.
yeah. But are you planning on doing anything special for Halloween gaming?
So yeah, interesting. You should ask. So I was, I was, and I may, but I have already changed my plans once.
Oh,
So
okay.
I pitched Curse of Strahd to my main gaming group,
Hmm.
and then I canceled it.
Oh.
So what happened is, this is something I would like to unpack on the show, although maybe not unpack all of it right now. But I would like to run, something like Curse of Strahd, but I don't think that I can really do that well at a pace of about once a month, which is as frequent as this particular group can do.
Hmm.
So I said, you know what, let's table that then. We'll like, I need to think about this. And in the meantime, we're gonna play some Star Trek, which I can do on
Hmm.
a once. We're gonna do a short Star Trek thing. I might try to do a little. I mean, Star Trek's not really all that Halloween-ish, but I might try
Hmm.
to throw in something that's a little spooky. We'll see. But but yeah, so actually my longer term question this fall is, can you do like a regular D&D campaign once a month and have it be an experience that's really getting the most out of D&D, or is that just not something, is my time better spent finding a different game that works better at that pace?
Mm,
So, I don't, do you
yeah.
have any instinctive reactions to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's going to dovetail into our topic pretty well. But I've got one thing to say, and then maybe we can dive into that and talk
Yeah.
about rules and stuff. It's surprising to me, like you mentioned Star Trek and Halloween, and like, are there any Star Trek Halloween episodes?
There are numerous episodes, that are a little spooky,
Hmm.
and the occasional episode that was clearly trying to riff a little bit off of Aliens or something like that.
Yeah.
But, it's a profoundly PG show
Yeah.
at heart, despite the occasional divergences into
Hmm.
more stronger stuff. And, there certainly has never been, a Star Trek Halloween special type of
Yeah.
episode, I guess.
Yeah. Seems like a shame. Seems like a missed opportunity. Although I think like all the directions I'm thinking right now would be pretty too jokey for for Star Trek. Like
Yeah.
like if they somehow we're taking the Enterprise around like trick or treating to different planets quickly, like over the course of one night.
Yeah,
But yeah.
the most you can do suspense really well in Star Trek.
Hmm.
And so the most horror-y episodes are the ones that kind of, Star Trek's ultimately not really about killing and defeating the monsters, right? It's
Yeah.
Star Trek is at its best when it's about encountering something that's alien and strange, but then, overcoming the hurdle that it presents in, preferably non-violently. Although, to be sure, there's plenty of phasers and stuff in Star Trek,
Yeah.
and you can get some good suspense out of, like just hiding what's really going on and letting the protagonist's imagination make something scary out of the uncertainty, I suppose.
Hmm.
But the ultimate that to for it to feel really Star Trekky, the culmination of that probably shouldn't be in the monster jumps out for like a final showdown.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it also like that structure sort of lends itself well. Like thinking about the like once a month gaming, I think that structure lends itself well to almost like one shot mentality, right? Like you can kind of like do a whole thing in a night pretty easily.
Yeah,
Whereas I think D&D like or yeah, Pathfinder, like they're always going to push you towards like longer campaigns.
yeah,
I mean, like how many of us have run a one shot that ends up being like 3 or 4 sessions long, right? It's
right,
like,
yep,
yeah, because it's just that's just sort of the nature of it. And I think like yeah, so to kind of go into our question about like do you require your players to read the rules? I think the question of, can I do a D&D game once a month like really sort of relates back to the rules more than anything in my
yep,
mind of like if you have such mechanical complexity having a month between games allows people to sort of forget how to play the
yes,
game a bit.
yep,
Like I think that's going to be that's your biggest barrier
yeah,
right there.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's, I mean, one big barrier is just that D&D has a bad time to plot advancement ratio.
Hmm.
I mean, D&D famously, if you're playing D&D once a month, it is trivially easy to imagine blowing an entire your 1 month gaming time allotment on one fight that's not even that important, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of the charm of D&D. It's part of the frustration of D&D. It's just something you accept as part of D&D, right?
Hmm.
But yes, the other thing is, D&D is pretty complex, but it really is most rewarding when you understand the mechanical pieces and you're
Hmm.
directing them towards the goals that you as the player want to pursue. And yeah, 4 weeks is just an awfully long time to go. And I certainly will lose my grasp on the details in 4 weeks, and
Hmm.
so I have generally a higher investment in this than the players do, so it seems kind of silly to expect that players would not have that same problem, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's true. The gaming group that I'm a part of right now, just because primarily my schedule is terrible. Right? We only meet about once a month. And I do find it hard, even as someone who has sort of like a rules brain, right? Like I think a lot of us GMs have this where it's like, oh, we really like learning rule sets. Maybe excepting John Corey. But like
Yeah,
so, like knowing that I have that and still like coming to the table and being like, all right, I gotta like kind of reacquaint myself with what is this character sheet, like what's going on with this rule system. Like that's one thing. And the system that we're playing is not like super complex, although there is some mechanical complexity there. But like with D&D where you end up having to cross reference I think so much other material unless you just have it memorized down cold, like that can be a big barrier towards just getting going, right? It's like yeah, like if you're getting into a combat situation and everybody's got to kind of remember how their spells work and like which dice to roll and like all those little things, it can just chew up time, right? And like if you're not yeah, and if you're not really like okay, well it's important that we're playing this game in particular, like this game, it's like yeah, maybe find a different game that's a little bit
yeah.
easier to play. Yeah.
Well, the role playing hobby is a funny one. For something that kind of traditionally has been based around such a mechanically complex system of rules and that sort of thing, it is possible to play for a long time and never to be asked to really, quote, learn the rules.
Mm-hmm.
Just the other day, I overheard my teenager was doing a D&D game session, and I overheard one of the players sharing, yeah, I've played in like 4 different D&D campaigns and I still don't have any idea what the rules are,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
And I think that's really common, and there's some good reasons for that. It would be unreasonable to ask for the investment of learning the rules before you started playing D&D.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a player, I think you have good reason to be skeptical about the time investment of that until you know for sure that a game is going to last, right?
Hmm.
Because of the famous problem we all face of being flaky sometimes, and having busy schedules, and the uncertainty of whether the game is going to peter out in 3 weeks or not.
Hmm.
And almost everyone I know, I, I started this hobby by reading the rules pretty much and then playing it, but almost everybody else I've ever encountered came into it by being invited to be in a game, and then it
Hmm.
caught their imagination, and then some of them went out, not all of them, some of them then went out and bought a player's handbook. And it's
Yeah.
hard to even know, I don't think the hobby really has a very clear trajectory in mind of how you go from not knowing the rules to getting the most out of the rules. So
Hmm.
it feels a little bit like such every GM has this problem, but it's uniquely tailored to the personalities and situation at their table, right?
Yeah, definitely. Because there's certain players that I played with that if I ask them to read the rules, they just be like, "Well, I'm just not going to play," right? Like and
Yeah,
other players who's like reading the rules is a core part of what the game is, right? Like it's that play away from the table, to borrow from the Splat book, right? Like that is a huge part of the play away from the table for them is to get the player's handbook and read it cover to cover and like memorize as much of it as possible, and all that. And like I don't even like as a GM, like as a DM, right? Like running 5e, like I think like I've never read the Dungeon Master's Guide right from cover to cover, and like I think
yeah,
we've talked about that in the past. It's somewhat of a rare feat for someone to make it all the way through. But similarly, like I don't know if I've read the player's handbook all the way through. Like I know I think I have. Like I think I have read read through it
yeah,
enough to know like what to reference when I need it. But I mean, I think there's always this element of, and I know we've talked about this. I think you even mentioned this on the most recent Splat book, which spoiler, Andy was on the most recent episode of Splat book,
huh,
which you go listen to. But like this thought of like there's this like one true way to run a D&D game that everybody sort of wants to do, which is interacting with every single rule that is available to you and like just really going crunchy with it and stuff. And I think that's sort of like the thing behind this question of like oh like what if you had a table where everybody had read the
yeah,
rules and really like like gotten to know them and stuff, like what would that change about your game, right? So like it's one thing to be like please make sure that you have a player's handbook, but if you sort of required everybody to have read it as well and like really understood it, like how would that change how you'd run your monthly D&D game if you just sort
yeah.
of knew that every time we picked up like everybody knew what their spells were, you didn't have to explain spell slots ever again, like
Yeah.
all those things.
Well, so you mentioned my appearance on the Splat book, and so I was on there talking about the game Baldur's Gate 3.
Hmm.
And there are times when it is frustrating when the players don't know the rules. And again, everything I want to put like the blanket caveat here that I don't blame players, especially when you're playing with like adults who have
Hmm.
lives and real problems and stuff like that.
Hmm.
I always try to be very very careful about what I ask of people who are already. Oh, it is a big ask for some people to show up once a month,
Yes, yeah,
right?
absolutely, yeah.
So that's my blanket caveat here. So if you hear me sneering at dumb lazy players, please don't
Yeah,
interpret that way. But
yeah, yeah.
so in Baldur's Gate 3 is a video game based on more or less on the 5e rule set. And there is a lot of joy in that game in discovering how useful all of the kind of mechanical options you have really are. So in Baldur's Gate 3,
Yeah.
uh,
They're the same, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, in BG3, learning what the jump like so the jump button will like is a very important button to learn how to use in Baldur's Gate 3.
Hmm.
And when you realize what that does mechanically, it's an important new tool in your toolkit that you will bring into every fight. There is a shove command in Baldur's Gate 3 that I would never like you in this game. I mean, you would never inherently use your action to shove something, right?
Mhm.
And then early on in the game, you'll be in a fight, I promise, and something will shove you off a cliff, and you'll be like, aha, that is like, that's a tool. So in when you read, like, for instance, the combat chapter of fifth edition or Pathfinder or whatever, there's a challenge in these games that, they often will feel like, ah, it's my turn. I guess I'll swing my sword.
Mhm.
I'll just swing my sword again, I guess. And that's fine. We've all been in those games and we've all experienced that. But there is more to the combat system than swinging your sword. There's, maybe there's jumping or shoving or flanking or disarming or
Mhm.
tackling or, and I'm just naming some, combat moves.
Yeah.
And I do think one cure for that, I can't really think of anything cool to do, I'll just swing my sword, is knowing that there are like 12 predefined other actions you could be taking. On the one hand, you might think to yourself, well, if the player wants to shove the monster, they can just tell me that and I will handle the mechanics of it. But they're not likely maybe to realize that they can shove the monster unless they've read that combat chapter and seen it.
Mhm.
So I don't know if I'm making sense here, but one of the value of reading even kind of tedious parts of the rules, like what are the things I'm allowed to do in a fight, are that they do kind of remind you, hey man, there's more here to do than swinging your sword. Here's like a dozen other things you can do instead of swinging your sword. And hey, maybe this will inspire you to think of even more stuff you can do instead of swinging your sword, right?
Mhm. That's yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah, because I think every time I have taken a trip to into the player's handbook to read a little bit about some of those things. It's like, oh, like that's how that works. Oh, but like that's how you can attack a second time if you have a second dagger. Like all those
Yeah.
sorts of things where it's like definitely the first handful of times, if not even now, if I ran a game right the second, like I'd probably get wrong, get wrong. But I mean, like whenever you're playing a game, right, you have sort of like the written rules. You have the rules that you as the game master have sort of glommed onto, or like how you're going to interpret them, and then how the players are going to interpret stuff too. You're sort of like meeting in the middle of all those things. So like I
Yep.
think playing something like Baldur's Gate 3, it's like the computer is not going to fudge its rules. Maybe it will. Like I don't know if there's like a fudge
Yeah.
mechanic in there, but like it's not going to fudge, and it knows all of those possibilities. Whereas when you like take a step back to your game at the table, where like everything is just sort of like you're referencing stuff. I think like that's where it's hard unless you've been presented with the list in some way, or remember that list to remember all those things. Maybe that's a problem with like how the game is presented itself. Like I mean, I'm just thinking about like like how different would D&D be if there was a single page sort of like quick reference guide that
Mm,
everybody had in front of them, like here are all
yeah.
the actions I could take, right? Like I mean, and then that slowly kind of that spins out of control. Now you have like a deck of cards and you're trying to like play stuff. It's
Yes.
it becomes a very different game. But I think there's that element of it, and I think like another thing this sort of reminds me of is like when you play with people that have never played D&D before, who are just excited about the idea of it. What I have found is you often are doing a lot of like boundary readjustment with them, because they might say stuff like, oh, I want to do this thing, and you're like, well, mechanically you can't do that, so like let's try to
Hmm.
figure out what
Yep.
that is. And that can be a little bit demoralizing, because you're like, oh, like they have a vision of this game that is more exciting than what it might actually be.
Yes.
And like you're sort of slow, you it's not like you're crushing it necessarily, but like you're trying to redirect that energy into like the mechanics that sort of fit and work together, because if you're going to play this game over the course of many months, right, like you sort of need to agree on those things. Otherwise, like what do you reference back, right? Like it can't just be like, oh, I do this thing. It's like, well, if you did that thing, like you would be able to kill anybody in the game. Like I
Yeah.
don't like, yeah.
I will
Right.
never forget
Yeah.
an exchange I had probably 20 plus years ago. I was playing with a pretty new group of people. Most of them were not gamers, and I had specifically said, "Don't worry, you don't need to know the rules. I'll take
Hmm.
care of it. Just tell me what you want to do." So one of the first things that one of the players said was, "I'm a wizard. Yeah, I'm gonna turn invisible. I'm gonna turn myself invisible, and then I'm gonna fly over there." And I saw the light dying in her eyes as I was like, "Well, your first level, you can't do any of that,
Yeah.
right? Like you can."
Hmm.
Here's a few much weaker things you can do, much less wondrous.
Yeah.
You could give yourself a +1 bonus to your saving throws,
Yeah.
but maybe in a year of playing you'll be 4th level and you can do some of what you just described to me, right?
Yeah.
um, well, yeah, it seems, if the players have not read the rules, so then part of your job as a GM is to teach the rules,
Hmm.
and I think that is requires more intentionality than at least I tend to think. And it's
Yeah.
more than just simply tell me what you want to do and I'll make the rule translation in my head and then we'll
Hmm.
carry it out. I think it means making sure you are using the rules, in the way you challenge the players. So if your goblins are always just swinging their swords every turn too, and they're never using that disarm
Hmm.
maneuver or whatever it is, whatever your game system has, they're never, if you are not directing mechanics against the players to demonstrate how they work and incentivize them to learn those systems,
Hmm.
then they're never really going to progress beyond that. I guess I'll swing my sword again, or just that they'll never stop, like, leaving it to you to do the job of like translating what they want to do into some like mechanics.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the translation there too, they're relying on you to translate it perfectly every time.
Yeah,
Right, and then, like, too, if they're just sort of taking a stab in the dark of, like, I don't know, like, can I do this thing? Like, and you never translate it to, like, "Oh, like, so you just shove them off the edge of that cliff." Right, like, if
right.
that's never presented to them as an option in the translation, it's like, well, yeah, like, what is lost from your game there? I mean, like, does it like, I've never used that in a 5e game.
Yeah, well, I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
Baldur's Gate 3, I don't think that, jump and shove are the powerful tools in like tabletop 5e
No.
that they are in by
Yeah.
Baldur's Gate 3. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. You and I, listeners won't get this, but you and I spent much of our
Yeah.
careers working for something that has the initials
Yes, we did. Yeah.
BG3, and so I keep
Yes, yeah.
defaulting to that when talking about Baldur's Gate.
Yeah.
Um, I'm
Um,
sorry. Where were we? Yes.
yeah, so okay, like I think like so getting back to some rules stuff. I guess yeah. So it sounds like you don't require players to read the rules. I've definitely never done that either. Would you ever require players to read the rules? Is there any sort of game that you'd run where you would say like it is important that you understand the mechanics of this before we play?
Ooh, it's hard for me to imagine me saying that.
Hmm.
When I ran Star Trek for the first time a couple months ago, I sent out the like quick start rules and I said, if you don't have to, but take a gander at these quick start rules if you want. And at least one player did that, and showed
Hmm.
up at the table, had read through the quick start rules. I don't know. Maybe I need to get over myself, but that feels like just such a big ask. Um,
Hmm.
Unless you were talking, I mean, I would do it if it was like a 12-page mini game rules light pamphlet,
Hmm.
sure. But anything bigger than that, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a tough sell. I think if it was I, it's hard because like I know you are also the rules explainer for board games when you're playing with people
Yes.
because like I am also that person, and it is endlessly fascinating and frustrating to me the different approaches that people take to listening to rules as they're being like yeah as you're just kind of explaining a board game, especially any board game of complexity where like the rules explanation is going to take 15 to 20 minutes minutes by itself, right? Like, and that might be on the low end if you're quick and good about it. And I mean, it's just like watching the range of human comprehension is just like, yeah, like I mean, some people it's like there's no amount of talking to them about the rules that will ever work, right? Like
Mhm.
they need to either read it themselves or they need to play the game in order to do it. Some people just like it's just not going to happen. Like it will never click with them. Like they will have a great time playing playing the game, but they're only ever going to sort of like repeat actions that they've seen someone else take or otherwise just ask someone else like what to do on every turn.
Yeah.
Right. And I think if you are going to play tabletop games, and I think if you're going to play tabletop games with a variety of people in your life, like I think you're just gonna have to sort of come to peace with come to peace with that like someone's gonna read the rules. A lot of people aren't. You can ask them as much as you want, but unless you're going to give them sort of time to read at the table altogether, like they're just not going to be able to
Yeah.
find the time to do it. Yeah. So I don't know. I think like my take on this is like I would never. I don't think I would ever require players to read the rules. I think I'd always try to encourage them to do it, and like I'd also bend over to kind of like represent them in ways that will help it make sense to them
Yeah.
as well. And vice versa. Like when I get rules like totally wrong, I try to be open to like players correcting me. Like, oh, like actually, this is how it is. Yeah, because I mean that's like yeah, because again, like I mentioned, I'm not going to go sit there and read all the books. Just don't have that sort of bandwidth in my life. Yeah, so like I think it kind of cuts both ways.
It's not your fault, right? It's not your fault if teaching people the rules is hard, or
Hmm.
trying to find out how much rules learning is appropriate in your case. That's hard. That's really hard.
Hmm.
And it you can tell it's hard because RPG rulebooks are just uh, here's my hot take for the episode. I mean, your typical rulebook is just not very readable, right? I
Yes.
mean, I have read a million of these things cover to
Yeah.
cover, and the reason they're not good is not because game designers are terrible, but because it is really hard to teach someone, especially through text, how to do something complicated like play Dungeons and Dragons. And then you have the added complication of that this game involves so much non-rules like management of you have to I'm searching for a verb here. I can't quite find.
Hmm.
You have to negotiate your relationship with the rules as you play in a way that you
Yes.
don't with a board game. And so
Yes. Yeah.
when you're writing your RPG rulebook, what do? Do you just present the rules in board game style fashion? Some rules do that. Go read Prime Directive, the Star Trek RPG published by the people that did Starfleet Battles, and that's section 2.1473
Yes.
effects of phaser fire on shields, right? So that's one thing. Do you lean into that negotiation and judgment call experience that is part of this hobby as well? There are rules that do that. I've read some rule books that are breezier to read and chattier, and then
Hmm.
when I try to use them at the table to get rules information, it's a nightmare because
Hmm.
they're not organized for efficient delivery of information, right? This is hard to do. And so I guess my main takeaway from this topic might end up being, yeah, it's hard, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thanks for listening to my rant there about rules like this.
Yeah.
I won't name and shame the game, but I recently was rereading the rules of a beloved game. I love it. The gaming community loves it, but man, was it a hassle at the game table to
Hmm.
use.
Yeah.
So
Well, I'm gonna get the name of that game when
you
we're
can
off the
get the name
air.
of the game
Yeah.
after we're done recording.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up there before we just like slowly devolve into like what are rules even?
That's
So,
right.
yeah.
What are they?
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Well, this has been Roll for Topic. We've really appreciated you taking a listen to us. We're happy to sort of be back at the helm, back with sort of our normal programming here. Yeah. If you want to, you should go check out our sister show, The Splat Book. They're also part of Roll for It Media. The Splat Book stars John Corey and Kyle Latino. Although last time they brought on Andy to come talk about Baldur's Gate 3, as we alluded to. I've listened to a little bit of that. I think I might take a pause on it until I can actually get a chance to play Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah, do
Yeah,
that.
yeah, for sure. But if you're playing Baldur's Gate 3 at all, like I think even just the first 15 minutes or so that I've listened to, it's definitely worth taking a listen to that. So I think both Andy and Kyle think about these things in a way that would appeal to game masters quite a bit.
Well, I'm glad you're saying that, Chris, because while I was having that conversation with Kyle, I was having a fantastic time talking to Kyle, but it did cross my mind like, is this even remotely interesting to listen to or not? I guess that's the question
Yeah.
every podcaster must ask themselves on a
Yeah.
regular basis.
Yeah, like you're in a niche of like so the Splatbook is a game design podcast, and they brought you on who like you like talking about game mastering stuff, and then you're talking about a video game, and then you're relating that back to game design and running games and stuff. So like if that sounds appealing to you, this is the podcast episode for you. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, I think that does it for us. Yeah. Again, thank you so much for listening to Roll for Topic. I've been Chris Salzman.
I've been Andy Rowe.
And remember, if your players are having fun, you're a great GM.